Record. Right on. Okay, welcome, dudes. ManCraft men. So I'll just get through, today's presentations around, as I said, David Hawkins, Power versus Force. He has a whole volume, a whole library of volumes that he's written on different topics. But I feel the most profound and influential has been, Power versus Force. There's two things that he talks about in his work in that piece that I feel really resonated with things that we could pragmatically or tangibly understand and then start to incorporate into our own lives, our own behavior, just by having this awareness of what he calls the map of consciousness, this pyramid of consciousness that he develops. And then there's this other area of, positive and negative, call them energies or states of being or otherwise. And I asked about uh, muscle testing before because a big part of his work is built on that muscle testing practice, and they call it calibration. And they go through, various, and he claims, in his book, and I've never validated any of these statements, but that like millions of tests have been done, and that the results are extremely consistent. And so, for instance, they'll do, and for those that are unfamiliar with muscle testing, there needs to be a practitioner that obviously knows how to do it, is able to maintain like a fairly unbiased delivery method. If you believe in, the scientific method and some of the things that like Freud and others said, it's all, once you observe it, it's too late. You've already imputed your bias. You've already imputed that scientific observer's bias. But in any event, that's what he says. You need a practitioner that knows, what they're doing, that knows how to hold themselves perhaps in a certain frame of mind or otherwise, that they're not unfairly influencing the testing. And in this case, I think they do this like straight arm process where, the administration of the test will be the man or woman asking a question, and it has to be a very specific way that you ask these questions. And then you press down on that hand, and depending on the response of strength or weakness, it allows them to calibrate, is Gandhi at consciousness level 200 or 300 or 400? Like they do things like that, and they've done it multiple times. And he's come up with this fairly, I feel, influential body of work, whether you believe in the muscle testing method or not. Some of these things are really helpful to understand and see just from your own kind of evaluation of behavior. And also, like, I find with these things, it's one thing to evaluate your behavior, to know when you're maybe not acting at your best, when you're perhaps flirting with your shadow side. Some people talk about shadow sides and gift sides and that kind of thing. Um, and that's really helpful because then you not only understand, okay, that's me perhaps not being my best self. And then when you see the other side of that coin, it's like, oh, now I kind of have a frame of reference, some awareness around, where I can orient my behavior to perhaps, be a bit more enlightened, a bit more positive, a bit more, conscious, call it, at the end of the day. So let me just hop into it, and then we'll have a nice little discussion around these topics. And you guys are both great for that. We switched to Zoom. Zoom has way more buttons than they used to have. I haven't used it.
Yeah.
So where is my share? There it is. Okay. So ManCraft Power versus Force. I love this photo.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into it. So as I said, Power versus Force, David Hawkins wrote this. I'm going to get into the map of consciousness. Um, this picture was hilarious. It just reminded me of Stephen King, like the Tommy Knockers or something. In any event, I liked it. Then we get into power patterns. So those are the two things, the map of consciousness being that pyramid of consciousness that I'll go through, the power patterns being kind of that negative, positive side of the coin when it comes to certain types of behaviors or actions or otherwise. And then, calls to action at the end of the day. Nice to know kind of why this is meaningful, how we can take some of this away, and maybe help kind of the bigger picture that collective consciousness or otherwise, and we'll get into that as well. So the map of consciousness, pretty powerful stuff, you know. As I mentioned with the calibrations, the map of consciousness goes from like 0, although I don't think anybody's actually at 0 or unless you're dead, and then all the way to 1,000. And the level at which there's a shift from weakness to strength is at that courage level, that 200 calibration level. And the way that he describes this stuff is, you know, below 200 is which is the world as a collective. He argues calibrates around that 200 level, maybe slightly below, and this has changed over time. But right now, I think that we're probably a bit lower actually with recent events that have happened and some of these other things. But we're starting, I think, to trend back up as you see what people are exploring and interested in, and how people are growing, at least what I'm aware of and what I'm seeing. I'd like to believe that we're actually collectively increasing, you know, that calibration level, that level of consciousness. Um, the way that I've set this up is, you know, below 200 is like weakness. You're focused on survival. You're focused on yourself. Just trying to survive, just trying to cope, you know, very strong victim kind of orientation below 200, powerlessness, that kind of thing. Apathy is one of the levels below 200. And then as you go over that 200 level, you start moving into a place of strength, of empowerment. It also becomes a place where you start obviously enveloping more than just yourself in your consciousness and in how you orient your action, how you orient your behavior. So you care about like the collective a little bit more. You care about that kind of that healthy mass outside of you, not just focused on yourself, that kind of you know, almost selfish, but it's survival. So that's just where you're at. I don't want to call it selfish. It's just that level of consciousness that you have kind of when you're stuck in some of those lower areas that are focused around survival. And so this is the whole pyramid. I've just kind of recreated it in a more meaningful way to present for the purposes of this call. But you know, what I've and his map is a lot larger than this. There's several other columns that he adds, but I feel these are the most pragmatic and easy to understand and maybe to take away. So you have that level of consciousness, the calibration that has been calibrated over, you know, what he argues is millions of tests by reliable muscle testers, and the results are consistently accurate. And then the emotion as well, like what kind of can be tied to that level of consciousness from an emotional point of view. And some of these make a lot of sense. You know, down at the bottom, you've got shame and guilt. Interestingly, one thing I learned as I went into some of his research and some of his lectures when he taught in university is that guilt and shame have like played a little dance as to which one is actually at the bottom. Right now, it seems to be shame, but there's other things I've seen where it's actually guilt. At the end of the day, it doesn't much matter. But those are really at the very, very, very bottom, that shame, that guilt, and then moving into apathy, grief, fear, all the way up to love, joy, peace, and enlightenment. What I really love about this is that, you know, as an individual that may have had, you know, a really difficult hand of cards, you know, to navigate, to manage in their lives and otherwise, you know, they can be, you know, sometimes feeling shameful, more likely apathetic, like nothing matters. What's the point? I don't care anymore, that kind of thing. Or even grief, right? Like that strong emotion of grief, despair, whatever you want to call it. And what I love about this is like just getting pissed off about it, like just getting angry about that is such a massive rise in consciousness level, because you can kind of understand how like moving from apathy to anger um, does shift forward into that willingness to change, things, or that motivator to possibly change things. And while, you know, some of these things are perhaps motivating for some, the reality is, you know, very few of us are ever going to see any level, you know, above, you know, 350 or 400. Like when he maps individuals and stuff that have actually resonated at these higher consciousness categories, like enlightenment would be like Jesus. And people like Gandhi, I think were like at 600 or 700. And so like these are very, very, very rare, you know, individuals on this planet. But more pragmatically, you know, the areas that are around that 200 is I think where most of us can look at this and say, okay, like I can see where I maybe need to grow. I need to become, more optimistic to come into that willingness consciousness, or I need to become more forgiving to move towards that acceptance. People may be having challenges in some of those spaces. And so you kind of understand how to shift into some of these consciousness levels, that emotion that goes with it. Is often what you probably need to embody at some level, in order to start exploring, I guess, some of this growth. Let's just call it growth at the end of the day. Um, and this is what I said earlier, somebody that's in grief will be in much better condition. I'm just going to move. I can't move it. But moving from grief, to anger, and then that anger, obviously, creating that energy to possibly take a next step to pride, and then to courage. Like you can see how that some of these things may seem like unhealthy behaviors. Anger often is probably seen, although necessary, and you need to release these things as they arise, but probably people aren't too proud of themselves for being angry when they lose their temper or otherwise. But that anger, when you look at it from this point of view, can be a huge rise, like in that consciousness journey. And so just to have a little more empathy for that kind of a scenario, and maybe to appreciate somebody being angry is probably a healthier way to be then apathetic, or to be grief stricken, or to be shameful, or living in guilt, right? So I like it for that point of view. And so, you know, and this is just that climb, right? We're always trying to grow, to expand, become more conscious, become more aware. And that self-perpetuating cycle obviously continues to feed itself. It doesn't mean that you're, physically expanding, or getting like super abilities and stuff. I view it as, really coming to a greater state of that inner peace, right? Like the more that you rise through some of these levels, probably the more peaceful, the more quiet, the more grounded you become inside, because less things are, you know, pissing you off, less things are activating you, less things are, perhaps uh, affecting your ability to enjoy your life. Because at the end of the day, most of this is us shifting, not controlling all of the circumstances that might potentially upset the apple cart from time to time. So let's move forward. Some of these stats I just felt were important, just to draw some kind of understanding as to where kind of we are as humanity. And he argues about 85% of the human race, which is massive, calibrates below that 200 level. And when you think about it, when I talked about Eros, and, one thing about Eros that Mark Gaffney kind of delineates at the beginning is that, we're all dancing around this. Most people are dancing around this void, right? That emptiness. And we have all these different addictions that like distract us from sitting in that emptiness and truly like spending the time that we need to spend there to authentically fill up. And so we have all these addictions, whether it's alcohol or drugs, whether it's food, whether it's gossip, whether it's whatever, like some things, anything that distracts ourselves from being in the present moment, could be considered an addiction in one way or another. And what's interesting about that is when you listen to, David Hawkins, he says that, that when to basically illustrate this level 200, and where most of the population or the human race calibrates below that level, he talks about addiction as well. And this is what I was looking for. So he says even recovering from like a single addiction can take a majority of a lifetime. And that also explains why it's very hard to make significant shifts in this map of consciousness. Most people won't move probably more or less than 50 points is what he says in Power versus Force. And what he talks about as the most common and insidious addiction is denial. And that plagues, all of mankind at some point or another, or always. And it's very nice, interesting when we read these things and you kind of draw lines through other texts and other learnings. But, when Mark Gaffney talks about that addiction to avoid kind of that emptiness or that void, most of us are in denial about that. Like, oh no, that's not an addiction. That's not a problem. I'm totally okay, blah, blah, blah. Like you hear that all the time, right? And I think that's what he's touching on here, is that denial that most people, have some level of denial. For me, that means an unwillingness to own your shit on some level or another, to an unwillingness to look, inside. We'd rather just be distracted and not have to go there. And a lot of people live that way. We all do in some respects, I'm sure, that we can identify. Hopefully that decreases as time goes on, and that's growth and that's learning and that's awareness, but it's definitely there. So let's get into power patterns.
Mm.
This is my favorite part of the book. And what he talks about is how important it is to differentiate between high and low energy patterns, weak and powerful attractor patterns. And these are all like, I don't want to call them opposites, but I would say different points of a continuum, right? Where you've got one side of the equation, perhaps the other side of the equation. They're not necessarily opposites, but what I like about it is that growth continuum. You can kind of see, oh, I'm hanging out over here. I need to maybe orient my behavior in this direction or towards that type of being or action or otherwise. And I think that's really helpful to understand. The other thing I didn't say earlier is there's a pretty big diatribe around power versus force and where that title comes from. And basically the way that he explains it is that, power is a natural law. Like love is power. And force requires resources, requires effort. And so his one of his large premises in the book is that over time, power will always beat out force because it doesn't require that consistent supply of energy, of resources, of other things that force does, right? It's almost like a natural law that certain things have power, like love, and over time they will win. And I kind of like that description as well. So let's get to the awareness of these power patterns and how we can maybe evaluate our own behavior along some of these lines. And so we look at these, and I'll show you the graph that I recreated shortly, or I guess the list of words. His is much, much, much larger. I just took some that resonate with me. But in any event, you look at these contrasting pairs, right? Not opposites, but just different lines of that continuum. And that by looking at these simple words, we can become aware of patterns that exist in our lives. And as I said earlier, with like shadow sides of behavior and maybe light or gifted sides of behavior, we can identify when we're maybe aligning on one side of the spectrum versus the other in our own awareness and our own behavior. And we can say, oh shit, I see myself, in my weakness or otherwise falling into that pattern again. And I need to shift my awareness and my behavior, to be in that more positive, powerful side. And, that's really what life is, right? Is like catching ourselves quicker, building the muscle to find that awareness more quickly when we are not acting as our best selves, as our most awake and conscious selves. And even when we know better, and it's just one of those things that makes us human at the end of the day. And so just becoming familiar with these can really help increase that inner power, that ability to notice, that ability to be aware and to understand kind of where things go, right? And some of these are we can probably identify several times in our lives where we've been on one side of the spectrum or the other, like looking at a negative pattern, like urging somebody to do something with us or to do something for us rather than inviting, right? The art of asking, the art of asking truly with no attachment or expectation that the answer will be yes, right? Like that is the ultimate powerful pattern, whereas that weak pattern would be urging or controlling or trying to dominate in that kind of way, right? A really big difference as well, which everybody I'm sure has caught themselves at one point or another, but empathy and pity are very different sides of a coin, right? That empathy, truly understanding and appreciating and respecting, regardless of your own personal views, someone else's human experience versus pitying them, right? And how disempowering, like to pity somebody, and how empowering to empathize and to support, trust, and love their reality, regardless of your own experience, your own judgments, your own feelings, right? So some of these are very obvious. Some of them that really resonate with me, like literal and intuitive, right? I can be a strong, literal, rational male. I pick at the details when it doesn't make a fucking difference in the world. And does that ever piss off, the woman in your life more than anything in the world, right? Be intuitive, like take that bigger context, that bigger meaning. And I often catch myself in this space. Maybe it's my lawyer brain that I'm retraining to be active more regularly or otherwise. But in any event, it's a real negative, positive side of that spectrum for me. And you can understand how it is when, being literal really doesn't achieve anything other than alienate the other person. Sometimes I think it does matter, like I'm drafting an agreement for two contracting parties and I have to be extremely literal. What does this mean? How are we saying it? There's a place for it, but most often in relationships, in our, you know, intimate relationships and our friendships and things, usually we're just being smartasses, or we're just trying to be clever, or we're trying to do something else that ultimately isn't a powerful behavior, isn't a powerful level of consciousness. And then stubborn and determined is another big one I'm sure many men can resonate with, but sometimes we're stubborn just for the sake of being stubborn, like we're just hard-headed, we're just unwillingness to be open. Whereas determined, like knowing what you want, knowing what you feel, knowing what you're passionate about, and being determined about driving in that, those are two very different things, right? So you can understand some of these things. And then obviously, controlling, allowing is a big one. But the other one for me was competition versus contending. Competing to prove something, to win something, to dominate something versus, contending just to show up as your best self and have fun doing it, right? Like there's a real big difference there. And empowering others to contend as well. Like there's some really interesting things. If you resonate with this, I can send you a snapshot of like the two-page dichotomies that exist in his book, because there's a hell of a lot more than this. These are just some of the examples that I felt kind of drive that point home a little bit. And so when you notice that you're being a little bit too literal or envious or dogmatic, you can see where there might be an opportunity to shift that awareness, shift that behavior. And to be honest, in my experience, when I've done that, I feel a lot lighter and better for it afterwards. And if you own it, what a great opportunity, to strengthen trust and bonds and with the people that you're like, oh shit, I'm sorry, I'm being hyper literal again. That's one of my shadow sides, and you just own it, right? Like, and it's amazing what happens when you do that with people. Like it's such a beautiful, humbling experience, and tends to be uh, not rewarded, but responded to with uh, love and grace at the end of the day. And so this I really love. And we're going to get into kind of this butterfly effect or this ripple effect or this collective consciousness where he takes his kind of work after he kind of elaborates on power patterns. And I love this quote, but he's like, the universe holds its breath as we choose each instant, which way to go. And the various essence of life is conscious, is what he argues. And so every act we carry out, every thought we have, every choice we make, adds to this mosaic, adds a ripple effect through the universe that affects everybody at the end of the day. And then he gets into this really cool discussion around counterbalancing. And when we look at that pyramid of consciousness, like the top being like joy, love, enlightenment, peace, and or peace before enlightenment, and then at the bottom, shame, fear, grief, whatever they were, what he then goes in to talk about is how a Gandhi at like, consciousness level 700 counterbalances like an exponential number of individuals at a minus 200 or less than 200 consciousness level. These are not linear comparisons or counterbalancing equations at the end of the day. And he goes through this, more specifically, how many millions and stuff. I think that's a little bit too obscure for the purposes of this discussion. But at the end of the day, important to understand that as you move up that consciousness pyramid, one level up that consciousness pyramid could counterbalance, millions of people. And it's really interesting to look at that and how, as a collective, as a humanity, it doesn't take a lot to really bring up that average. And so empowering in a way, and just interesting to think about. And that's the power of the positive. And we talked about briefly power versus force, but that exponential power of that power to counterbalance the negative, that loving counterbalancing, the fearful. It's not a apples to apples on the scale. It's very much exponentially weighted in that positive side, and how that exponentially counterbalances a number on the negative side. And that's what I explained here. So we don't need to go over it again. But this, is something he says, me paraphrasing, but the difference in power between a loving thought and a fearful thought is so outrageously enormous, it is incomprehensible. Like he actually lays out the calculation of it on some level. And it's sometimes when you look at these, double-digit exponents of numbers, it's almost impossible to even calculate or comprehend with the simple human brain, unless you're one of those autistic mathematicians that can do crazy high numbers in their heads. But in any event, you get the point. So taking all of that into consideration, that map of consciousness, those beautiful, powerful, and negative power patterns, I picked out two specific highlighted calls to action that he has later on in his book that really resonated with me. And one is like, to become more conscious is the greatest gift anyone can give to the world. In a ripple effect, that gift comes back to its source. So just remembering that, like how we behave, how we work on improving, increasing our consciousness, just becoming more open, more accepting, more tolerant, more human, more grounded, those kinds of things. You don't have to necessarily buy or adopt, what he lays out as that level of consciousness. But just believing that, that creates something out in the world. That energy goes out into the world and has an impact. He argues, the greatest gift that anybody can give. But whether you believe that or not, I don't think anybody would deny that you're not gifting something on some level, by being aware of this and making an effort to obviously show up in that more powerful place. The other thing he says that really resonates. Oh, did I miss one? Where did it go?
Skip.
Yeah, you quickly flipped over one.
Oh yeah, the only way to
Yeah.
enhance one's power in the world is by increasing one's integrity, understanding, and capacity for compassion. And so that's where I'm talking about, some of these other ideas like compassion he doesn't talk about in the pyramid of consciousness. But just, it all starts with awareness, like willing to be aware, that there are dark sides, weak sides, powerful sides, light sides, whatever you want to call it. I don't think anybody would deny that we would rather be less on the shadow side, less on the negative side, more on that power side, more on that enlightened side, whatever we want to call it. And it all starts with awareness, like just awareness of some of these things that exist, and then awareness of our own behavior and patterns, and aligning that, right? Like, oh, I can see, just being open, like we're all human. We've all spent time on both sides of all of these equations, really just knowing like, oh, geez, that's that behavior again, taking time to really reflect on how you show up, how you handled certain things throughout the day, how, in the moment, sometimes how you're behaving, and catching yourself like that muscle, right? Just like in yoga, come back to your breath. When you recognize that you're losing yourself in that monkey mind, come back to the breath. Don't punish yourself. It's just a human natural thing to do. Just catch yourself, build the muscle to be aware quicker, and then bring yourself back. And that's really what we're doing with some of these other concepts as well, is understanding kind of where these dichotomies exist, where some of these opportunities exist as I see them, and then really humbly and with intention, applying it into our own behaviors and lives. So that's basically it, my friends. Next week, we're going to explore boundaries. This is a really cool, I learned a lot actually creating even this webinar for next week, which is of course already done. But I learned a lot about boundaries and where obviously I'm failing to have clarity and intention around boundaries. So I'd really recommend that you check that one out as well. So on that note, just a few minutes over, but we spent some time chatting in the beginning, and I just want to stop the share. Hopefully, I don't think we got anybody else today. No, we didn't. So we're okay. So yeah, guys, like it's a pretty small group, so I'll be so happy
Yeah.
if I have to. But what do you think?
I was making notes throughout because it's I had read this book on your recommendation, Dan, and
Yeah.
it's hefty.
Oh,
Like
huge. Yeah.
it's not an easy read, but it's really good. And I actually got through it relative a lot faster than I thought it would. But there's a
Yeah.
few points in your presentation that I've keyed on to, and maybe this is just me, but maybe his statement that a person can only really move 50 consciousness points or whatever in a lifetime doesn't resonate, and maybe that's anymore. Maybe the world's changed, and I don't know if you're tapped into the healer community, if you're tapped into the meditative community, into the self-work community, into this idea that the consciousness of the planet is raising due to recent global events and just sort of people kind of shaking the cobwebs off. It feels different than that.
Mhm.
And I say that from I suppose personal experience, but I wonder if that sort of map of consciousness, which I think is amazing, you can see yourself, or I can see myself on the spectrum, multiple points of it throughout my life. And certainly in the last 2.5 years with tremendous sort of focus on the healing, kind of like moving quickly through some of those paradigms where you shed fear, you shed shame and guilt and all those types of things come away really quickly. So you kind of feels like you're burning up that ladder pretty fast. And I
Mhm.
wonder if it's sort of like we all have like a maximum potential plus or minus 50. I don't know what your guys' thoughts might be on that. But related to that would be this idea of this general consciousness raising. And there was one other statement you made that was below the level or above the level of 200 or at the level of 200, people stop blaming and start taking accountability, I think
Mhm.
is the key there. And that it was an 85%, which was a staggering statistic, but maybe makes sense. Um, but do you guys notice that? I have noticed this idea of people not stepping into their sort of authority, their agency, their power in life until something monumental shifts it, and where you're like, crap, I got to stop blaming everybody. But I see this like idea of victimhood. I lived it, and I also see it now around me quite profoundly in a lot of people that I love, a lot of people I care about, or inside of organizations and teams, where it's sort of like you really are living in this victimhood, waiting for somebody to tell you what to do, placing blame if you're doing a bad job or you get in trouble for something, whatever that happens to be, instead of really this extreme ownership of who you are and what you're accountable for on this planet. So that sort of ties together with this idea of how how much flexibility do we have to actually move up that ladder? Has that changed since this book has been published? And do you
Mhm.
see that in the collective?
Yeah, I'll let Joel answer the second piece because I know that he could just talk from his experience of all the people that he works with that don't want to take accountability for their own shit. But on the first part, I think what he talks about too is that I, I I don't think he says it's not possible. I think what he says is most of humanity, most of the planet, will not shift more than that small increment. And what he says in that respect that I remember is that a lot of our planet live under pretty oppressive circumstances. They're not as fortunate perhaps as we might be in our human experience in the West or otherwise. um, to have those opportunities to really, to grow, to be independent, to explore, different ways of thought, to have access, to this information sometimes and that kind of thing. Like, there's a lot of the planet that live under, pretty oppressive, and difficult regimes where I think what he says, the level of apathy, particularly that helplessness, that hopelessness, that it doesn't matter anymore, is very, very strong. And I think when there's a large volume of, a country or community existing in that space, it can really, bring it down. But yeah, I definitely think it's possible. And I definitely think we do in at different points in our lives or otherwise where we might catch ourselves. Like, I don't think you're stuck in one level. I think you've got personally the ability to, um, I guess, be more conscious in certain circumstances. And in other circumstances, perhaps you're not being so awake and so conscious. You're getting stuck in some of these other areas.
Yeah,
It's
well said.
more fluid and dynamic, I think. Um, but I'd love to hear what Joel has to say about, um, yeah, just accountability, like people actually, you know, taking that step out of victimhood and into empowerment, and realizing that they're the one, you know, that needs to change, and they're the one that has the power, you know, to grow and to ultimately change their circumstances, change their universe, their human experience.
Yeah, I definitely run into it a lot in the coaching. Absolutely. Like, I just want to reflect a little bit on, you know, what was mentioned earlier, Tyler, about like, I don't, there's some of that, I like a lot of this material, but what I don't resonate with is, I think when people, and I'm not saying this group, but I think when some people look at those lists, they apply a value judgment to those things, which is something I kind of don't like about those kind of levels. Like, this one's better because it's higher, this one's not as good because it's lower. Because I think once we make that shift into that 200, what he's talking about, that self-awareness piece, then I think that whole thing shifts suddenly, like the whole thing, because you're no longer operating unconsciously in those areas below 200. You might be operating actually a little more consciously in those lower levels below 200, right? In the way that those lower levels are starting to demonstrate to you what your subconscious or what your societal or what your cultural beliefs are, right? And how those are causing you to let go of your power or give away your power, or, you know, not want to take accountability. So to dive into that part, it's like definitely in the coaching and relationships, you see that a lot for sure. Um, and to reflect on what you were saying, Dan, I think I do agree. I think it's in a lot of the part of the world, you have people who are just trying to survive. So it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? When people are like in that lower levels of the pyramid, it's like they can't focus on anything else. Like, they don't have the capacity to focus on anything else. So it's hard for them to lift out of that. But then you see some places in the world where it's not third world like that, but people are still choosing to give away their power. In a lot of ways, maybe they have like an oppressive government or a dictatorship, and it's some of them, it's like they're comfortable in that, giving away the power, right? I'm often surprised at how often people do it, and I've seen it, you know, not just in my coaching, but also in, you know, around the sweat lodge and ceremony. You see people coming for 10 years
Mhm.
and praying for the same thing, and they don't realize that they're just giving their power away constantly. Like, they're not wanting to shift over into that, taking ownership, taking accountability.
Mhm.
Um, And I think some of that is I think some of that is societal in nature. Some of that comes from, you know, government, and you know, we're convinced that, you know, of certain things,
Mhm.
um, you know, and we're in survival mode a lot of the time. So I would agree with that 85%.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm not sure what I'm not sure, to reflect on what you were saying, Tyler. I'm not sure what the turning point is for people. Like, I've seen different ones over the years, right? Like, I've seen, you know, with people with addictions, it's like hitting the bottom of the bottle is the turning point, right? And maybe it's not, maybe it is, you know.
Mhm.
Um, you know, one elder used to say, he said that people used to come to him and ask for help in quitting an addiction, like, help me to stop drinking, help, and they gave him the powers if it was up to him, you know. And he would just say to them, he'd like, well, just keep drinking. And they would look at him like weird, right? And he'd say, well, he said, eventually one day you'll like decide to quit, or you'll be dead. Either way, you'll be not drinking anymore. Right? Like, that's essentially, like, he'd put the power back into their hands, right? He'd say, you know what, it's really up to you.
Mhm.
Um, you know, and
Singer does the
sometimes,
same thing. Just to interrupt you, sorry, but Michael Singer does the same thing with cigarettes.
yeah,
Don't put the cigarette in your mouth.
that's right.
It's up to you, man.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
just for you, Greg, thanks for joining. But we're just talking about how in his pyramid of consciousness, David Hawkins has this like critical level of 200. And what resonates with it is it's kind of a shift from like victim mentality to like empowerment mentality. That's where that shift kind of happens. And we're talking about how he also
yeah,
says most people are stuck under that level. And it's really difficult in many situations, to
Mhm.
rise. And Joel was just talking about his experience with people and their willingness to kind of own their shit, to empower themselves and step out of that victimhood, in terms of
Yeah.
taking, I guess, ownership and taking control of, their own human experience.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I've
cool.
seen, oh, sorry. I was
Go
just
ahead.
gonna say, I've seen
Yeah.
a few ways. I've seen a few ways. We were just talking about the different ways over the years and doing my coaching and things. Um, Sometimes it's a big thing, but sometimes it's a little thing for people too. Like just having an awareness that you feel stuck and you don't know why you're stuck.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's enough, but you need to have, most people don't have the knowledge or the mentorship or whatever it is you want. I guess it's the hero's journey, right? They don't know what they don't know. And
Mhm.
they finally kind of discovered they're in this, oh my God, the world isn't what I thought it was. Um, but they just might not have the knowledge to understand why they might feel stuck. They're like, especially men, I would say, especially, which is great for the men's group, is that we're told how we're supposed to be so much, right? By society, by women, by stories, by parents, all these kind of things, right? And so I see a lot of men, when they're younger, pursuing more superficial kind of purposes, and then they achieve those and they're like, oh, okay, now what, right? But they don't know what to do next. Like they think, okay, well, I've done whatever I'm supposed to do. And their partner is starting to like bark at them all the time and they don't know why. And, their kids are acting up and but they're essentially kind of coasting in a way. And that's another form of giving away the power that I've seen men do a lot, or giving away, I mean, literally some men do it with their partners, with their wives. It's like the honey-do list and all that kind of stuff. It's like, oh, if I give my power away, then I don't have to think about anything. I don't have to, she'll just be happy if I do whatever she tells me to do. You know,
No
so
opinion means no conflict, right?
yeah, yeah. So I've seen it. Yeah. I don't know what the turning point is. And I think that's a great conversation, Tyler. It's like, what is it? What are, and I've thought about that a lot. What are the different ways that people kind of just, the light bulb goes off suddenly? And
It-
it's like, and they recognize, holy shit, I've been giving myself away all these years, you know?
yeah, I think to your point, Joel, is really well said that you don't know what you don't know. You don't know when you're asleep because
Yeah,
you're. And but what I do find groups like this, first of all, are powerful because you can come into a
absolutely.
group like this looking for camaraderie and find wisdom. And in that sharing, there's just tremendous power. And I wish I had something like this when I was younger,
Yeah.
to make me think differently than how I did at the time. The other thing I think is if you come through that and you bounce off the bottom and you find your way through and you come to this side of the fence is it was powerful in my iboga journeys.
Mm.
Was the statement was when you heal yourself, you heal others.
Yeah.
And I've found that to be absolutely true in a very short period of time, like 2 years. It's amazing the sphere of influence that can have. It's amazing when you are authentic and in your integrity and you share your experience unapologetically with people, how many people it pulls in. They're like, oh, I'm not alone. And
Yeah.
that's powerful. That's powerful knowledge.
The other way
Yeah.
I've heard that said is the work you do on yourself is the gift you give everybody else, which is a nice same kind of idea.
For
Um,
sure.
it's interesting you mentioned iboga or other psychedelics for that matter, or the dark night of the soul, like that real rock bottom. But it seems that those kind of two things can be really effective to kind of, I don't know, defibrillate that denial, defibrillate that state of like of unknowing or blindness. Like you're like, you get that glimpse into, I don't think it does the work. Like you've got to do the work and that'll never end. But I mean, it does give you that glimpse, maybe that perspective, that awareness that maybe was a little too obscure before or a little too hopeless before, or whatever you want to call it. I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
it flicks
Yeah.
the light bulb on in the room so you can see the room and you can
yeah.
start to navigate.
So
Yeah. In my coaching, it's interesting because there's a different rock bottom there, obviously, right? When people come and they're looking for a silver bullet, everything's a disaster.
yeah.
And usually men and women both, usually when I say, well, you have to own what's yours, some of them just seriously, they'll let their relationship implode rather
Mhm.
than own what's theirs. Like it's amazing to me sometimes. But to reflect on what you're saying, there, it's like I always say to people, like, realization is the doorway to new work, right? Like, some people think realization is the thing, you
No,
know, but even in spirituality, when you have like a oneness experience or something, I mean, that's an invitation to continue to do the work, right? And any kind of realization is, but I agree with you, Tyler. I think these groups are fantastic. Coaching can be good too, but there's still people that prefer to give their power away. And generally that's a fear thing. There's different reasons for it that I've seen in my experience around the ceremony, as much as coaching and, you know, different spiritual groups. I even see it in, and I might be treading a bit too close, but I even see it in like some of the new age circles, spiritual circles, where people are pursuing experiences over and over and over and over and over again, like, you know, going to a sound bath ceremony and that's the thing that's gonna heal me. It's like, no, that's just another way of giving away your power in a way, right? It's like the healing happens within, you know, ultimately, and that realization. And yeah, but
Yeah, these are tools, not silver bullets, to your point.
absolutely, yeah.
yeah, they can be great tools, but ultimately,
Oh yeah, they're fantastic tools.
Uh,
Yeah,
what the Alan Watts quote, the psychedelic guy, he's like, when you get the answer, hang up the phone. Yeah, I love that quote.
right?
Hmm.
Oh, Alan Watts, yeah.
yeah,
And it, you know, what a wise guy, and he basically drank himself to death, right? Like,
yeah.
you know, it's really just, it's amazing how much knowledge you might have, how aware you might be. It's still not fucking easy. Like,
No,
you know, um,
no. It's like David Data says, the more you know, the harder it gets, right? The
yeah,
more the feminine is going to challenge you and
yeah,
like want
yeah,
you to improve, whether that's a partner or whether that's the world around you, right? It's like,
yeah,
you
it's
know,
true. That's why
yeah,
Peter says the happier I am, the shittier I feel
exactly.
all the time.
Yeah.
The same quote. Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah, the corporate adage is the better you are, the better you better get, because there's more coming for you.
yep,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, fair enough. Pretty
But
cool.
that's the masculine edge ultimately, is what we're talking about when we say that, right?
It's totally
Yeah,
true.
absolutely.
Dan, we've been talking about leverage and lifecraft therapy in personal development, and a few minutes ago you guys were talking about how you have to step into responsibility to cross that 200 threshold. You have to go from kind of victim mentality
Yeah.
to self-responsibility. And there's an interesting thing there where the more you perceive that your life is fucked up, the harder it is to swallow, to come back to power. And so it
Mhm.
can become a downward spiral, because you can't turn your life around when you're not at cause, when you don't believe that things are happening for you, not to you.
Yeah.
And in our work in the clinic, that's completely salient because, as you said, Joel, there's no magic bullet. These tools that we have can be pathways into ourself. And lifecraft therapy, which has a backbone of clinical hypnotherapy, it can be tremendously powerful, but it's no exception to that rule. If
Mhm.
you show up to a lifecraft therapy session like this and like, it's not my fault, my girlfriend's a bitch,
That's right.
and I'm just unlucky and whatever, then it's not going to get you very far. But one thing that's been really powerful for us, and this is the whole thesis of what I wanted to share, is that we can bring people through a really really neat reframe as we're explaining lifecraft therapy to them. And in the process of explaining lifecraft therapy, we help people understand that your unconscious mind drives so much of your behavior. It drives your perception of yourself
Mhm.
in the world. It determines what information from your environment makes it through to here and what that means to you. It determines the behaviors available to you or not available to you. And so it very much determines the outcomes in our life and how we experience those. As adults, we tend to overestimate our level of autonomy, don't we? We tend to think, oh yeah, I ate that because I wanted to and said that because I wanted to. And to some degree, we do have conscious choice in there, but the unconscious mind will not let you do something, or will not let you stop doing something that it believes is not safe for you. And it takes on beliefs in error all the time.
Mhm.
And so maybe when you were a little boy, something happened, and the only way your unconscious mind can make sense of that is to take on a belief like, you're not lovable. And now for the rest of your life, it's trying to keep you safe in a world where you're not lovable. And so it's going to drive behavior, drive experience in directions you don't want to go. And that will continue to happen because your unconscious mind is the foundation of your whole nervous system. You cannot conceive of a thought, let alone take a behavior that's out of alignment with what your unconscious mind thinks. And so the reframe is this: changing behavior in the moment after a trigger, that's not really available to us, right? When someone triggers an unconscious response, and now the emotional cascade is going, the fuck you train is leaving the station, the anger train is leaving the station. There's a limit to how much you can just chill, man, just chill, right? And maybe you can do it once, and then that same trigger again, and that same trigger again, and pretty soon, poof. And so what we tell people is, it's not your fault, but you have all the power in this deeper work. And that seems to really massage people, where they can take off this massive backpack of bricks that they thought they had to carry, which is responsibility for the recurring habits that they can't stop and all the damage and issues they've caused in their life from these unconscious habits. We can tell people that you have responsibility, but it's not your fault that you've been behaving this way, and you don't have the conscious ability to always change those things like this. And that seems to be enough to get guys leaning in, and women too, into enough responsibility, and importantly, also simultaneously a path forward that they feel empowered to take, right? And that's been a really, really neat chicane for us to thread. Because even if you bring someone into hypnosis, if they're not at cause, if they're not in responsibility in life, you're not gonna be able to do anything with them. But if you can bring them in grace into both acceptance of what's happened and their role in it and their power going forward, you can really, really shift things. And that's what I think of when I think about that threshold, right? The difference between 199 and 201. It's not 2 points. That's a significant barrier to traverse. Right.
Yeah, we talked about those exponential leaps as well to some extent. I love that you said that. I'll talk about it more in boundaries next week. But even though our subconscious mind is driving the bus a lot of the time, there's a huge amount of information when we look back at the patterns that repeat themselves in our lives. And we can consciously do that. We do that, with boundaries. I'll invite you to do that in previous relationships, because those are often things that have existed in patterns or otherwise are great opportunities to uncover where like some of those healthy boundaries ought to exist for you. And we'll get into that later. But I do love that what you said there, Greg, and there is a huge amount of information in looking back at those patterns and understanding where maybe some of that programming might exist, to cause us in some way, to keep repeating these patterns. And there's a lot of magic that can exist in there. And I know, Greg, you do like with the Soundcraft stuff. I posted 2 things in the chat. One Soundcraft that's happening tomorrow. I hate this automated Zoom.
Yeah, and if you go up, there's a little green camera on your.
I'll turn it off.
You can click that and then turn it off there. It's in reactions.
Yeah, I turn it off. So bizarre. Like you just point balloons or dildos.
That's an Apple thing.
Like it appears all that.
Yeah.
If I could predict what it was going to be, I don't like that it does it for me, because then it's just going to be the worst thing at the worst time. But anyway, yeah, the Soundcraft stuff is really cool, because it does kind of like psychedelics, or like, hitting rock bottom sometimes. Those energetic shifts that can happen with, and I think it's so appropriate. Jeanette and I watched this really cool segment on Gaia yesterday about vibration, about sound, and what it does to the human body. And they also looked at, they calibrated like the hertz of all of the organs and that kind of thing. And then under like scientific observation and with other machines that they measured this stuff, they were exposing like organs that were obviously in diseased states or weakened states to these hertz that were aligning with that, what they were saying, the heart's vibration is what, like 535 or 600 hertz or whatever. There's different levels. And what was happening at a cellular level when they were exposed to those hertz was really miraculous. And so it was really cool. So sound therapy can be really cool. And I know that Greg's doing a cool sound thing tomorrow. And we're doing a Via Ferrata ManCraft event on May 26th. And that willingness to take ownership, that willingness to, I guess, build that muscle to believe in your instincts and your ability to create the change in your life that you need to be more fully human, to be more empowered, to be more aligned with your purpose, with your sharing your gifts to the world. When we get together and do these things, my hypothesis, this is going to be our first event, but this is like a 500-meter via ferrata, assisted climb with guides, harness, clips. Probably a intimidating. I know you said, Ty, that you're a little intimidated by it. But the beauty in these things is like is coming out of something, of an experience like that, where people are supporting you, you're doing this, that confidence meter might dial up a few points, right? That if that empowerment might dial up a few points, and like, give you that motivation, give you that self-confidence, give you that awareness that you can actually A, do hard things, but B, change your circumstances. And we're going to combine some sound therapy, some breath work with that as well. Because in these settings, like on the top of a mountain, you can imagine how profound some of these modalities can really be. But also after getting together, challenging yourself and overcoming, whatever anxieties, fears, blockages, or you have in doing some of these activities, then taking a back seat and allowing some of these other, sound therapies and things, perhaps unblock some energies, cause some shifts, cause some awareness. It should be really exciting to see, what the experience is that people have on that. So I put those in the chat. Check them out. And we're just past 9, smaller group today, but I like this group because I'm super comfortable with this group. So it was a nice, easy presentation, nice, easy chat. I did remember to record it, Greg. So
Cool. Good.
I have been forgetting, but I'll make it a standard practice with practice.
Two things on the Via Ferrata, Dan. It's 180 meters. I did not sign up for a 500 meter.
500 feet, 500 feet, sorry.
500 feet.
500, 600 feet.
Yeah.
And second, you can carry my ass up there if I get too freaked out. I trust you.
Yeah, Greg and I are training for Gimli, so I'll gladly carry you up for the training. I might have to pass it off to Greg.
I'll let you know that if you get to the top and you don't feel like climbing down, you can for a cool $2,000, you can have a helicopter come get you.
Royalty.
And
Yeah.
they're just across the road. So I got their number. You just let me know.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Or we could
The
like,
the Soundcraft thing, sorry, Dan, the Soundcraft thing tomorrow is it's only $33 and it's a 2-hour online thing. We have a really cool clinical tool that allows us to bring custom multidimensional soundscapes that are really cathartic. They ground you into a therapeutic psychedelic state. And so if you've ever been curious about it, Joel, this would be a good one because it's super cheap and it's kind of a fun one. You're going to get lifetime access to the audio so you can listen to it over and over and have that deep meditative experience as many times as you want to. And something similar is going to be delivered on the summit of the Via Ferrata. Like Dan said, we're going to set up the hammocks up there, and Dan's going to guide a breath work on the front end. And then you're going to have this cathartic sound. It's pretty cool to do those in a hammock, like literally rooted to the mountain, and you can just feel the energy of this monolith in your hammock. And listening to that stuff, it's pretty cool.
yeah,
We
I'll carry the hammocks, you can carry Tyler.
Mhm.
Yeah, right on.
I've done that one with a lot of gear before, a lot of weight. One time I hauled a flat of water up there, among other things. I think I had about 90 pounds in my pack. But it's a really chill climb, guys. Like if you can climb a fucking ladder, and if your butthole pucker is not too aggressive, then you can handle this. It's not
You can
it's
climb a
not that
ladder for a few hours, first of all.
fair, but there's a lot of the sections aren't fully vertical.
No.
And there's a lot of ledges to stand on. You can, every 10 minutes you can stand and chill,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
it's probably like a 5'7",
Not even.
6. Yeah,
I think it's
Yeah.
I think it's that.
just
There's
because.
another one. Go ahead.
Well, I said just because of the vertical, it's probably a 5'6" or 5'7" because it's sustained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's another one that's they've rated it at a 5'9", but it's full on. Like it's some underhung sections. Like you got to be able to fully support your weight and um yeah, so it's legit. I wouldn't recommend it for a big group unless we'll take a look at the registration stand because we can always pivot. It's only up the road. And if everybody who joins wants to really climb something, then we can do that. But the Fox is great. It's a really fun one.
Maybe we'll pop we'll break guys into it with Fox. And
Yeah, that's a good idea.
it's just we could do the other one another time.
We can do it when we go for scouting too. We can go and do it.
Yeah, good idea. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome,
Are you a
guys.
climber at all, Joel?
Sorry?
Are you a climber at all?
No, I've never done it. When I was younger, I had some interest, but I never pursued it. Yeah.
You're still young, Joel.
Yeah.
You're still young.
Well, the
Well-
chance of dying on a Via Ferrata is pretty well zero because you're redundantly secured to these permanent cables all the way up.
Mhm.
So it's a pretty low risk way to get a cool mountain climbing.
Yeah, it's probably more people die having sex than climbing Via Ferratas.
Or in
True.
Steam, or in Steam's probably. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, heat.
Awesome.
Sure.
Good chat, guys.
Okay, yeah, thanks for your time, guys. I appreciate it. We're a little bit over, but that's okay. Joel,
Okay.
I'll see you soon. I'll see you all soon. Awesome to have you guys here and make the most of your Tuesday night.
You betcha. Joel, I'd love to get a coffee with you sometime. Are you in Calgary?
Yeah, I am. I'm in the Northwest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan, do you have Joel's contact? Can you ship it to me?
Yeah, he does.
I will connect you guys.
Awesome, for sure.
Hey guys, sending you good vibes. We'll chat soon.
Likewise,
Cool.
bye for now.
Take care.